Hello, my name is Zachary Cush, and you're about to find out why I love Final Fantasy VII, or at least in as short a time as I can spiritually manage. The longer version will be out later. Final Fantasy VII is the first piece of fiction I ever fell in love with, and even after 20 years of encountering and re-encountering its fiction, I still find it absolutely captivating. And for 20 years, I've never quite had the chance to express what it is I love about this classic game. Alas, from the painful oubliette of silent patience comes crisp opportunity. For despite its status as a classic, it has received very little attention in this new age of verbose YouTube video essayists. And thus I spring forth from the fogs of obscurity to bend your ears to the descriptive breadths of my decades-acquired vocabulary to inform you, and yes, I do mean exactly you. It's you I made this video for. And you're gonna find out just why it is that I love Final Fantasy VII. So, clutch tightly thine ticket stub, young one, for there ain't no getting off this train we're on. Not till we get to the end of the line. But alas, before we depart the station, we here at the train station would like to issue to all of our passengers a spoiler warning. While I shan't be directly divulging any specific plot details and will not reveal the game's biggest secrets, yes, not even that one, the nuanced perspective elucidated within the purview of this very video essay will necessitate an in-depth discussion of the mechanics of the game's fiction, which the text itself so expertly explains to its players throughout the first half of its runtime. This perfect expositionary pace can only be experienced blind once. The auspices of this video will take that away from you. Such is the price of knowledge. So if you haven't played the original Final Fantasy VII and think for even a second that you would enjoy playing it, click off this video right now. Open up your Steam profile and purchase it. It's like $12. You'll spend $12 on a goddamn Chipotle burrito. And like those don't even become part of your spirit. This video will be waiting for you when you've finished. But right now, this is your only chance to encounter this game's fiction with a fresh perspective. You have thus been spoiler warned. As with all things loved, I love Final Fantasy VII for a deeply personal reason. However, age and experience have blossomed that deep appreciation from a difficult-to-communicate inner emotion bubble into a tangible, structured essay for you to enjoy. Given that this is the short version, I shall save my emotion bursts for elsewhere, and instead channel my feelings into the erudite dispassion of a lecture. So class, open your textbooks to page 394, as I endeavor to teach you, and yes, I do mean exactly you. It's for you that I have made this video. And I'm going to teach you how to love Final Fantasy VII, just as I do. Thus shall I gift to you my experience of appreciation, which can be broken down into 4 main categories: design, structure, character, and theme. And more specifically, we'll be covering how these 4 categories intertwine to deliver a holistic human experience, and thus a quintessential model for how to craft fiction. To begin to understand something is to boil it down to its most basic components. For example, the most basic component of matter is atoms. The basic component of music is notes and rhythm. The basic component of cooking is ingredients. To achieve a holistic understanding of cooking is to understand the minutiae of various ingredients and how they interact, what functions they provide, and how they fit together. For fiction, I argue that the most basic component is setup and payoff. You introduce, establish, and explain something, and then you make that something thematically or narratively important later. Sometimes much later, sometimes whole discs later. And ideally, you make that something both thematically and narratively important. These are your biggest punches. For example, let's look at a series of films I haven't talked about much, The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, the character Bilbo gives Frodo a mithril vest. This is setup. Frodo is impaled with a spear in the mines of Moria, but the mithril vest saves his life. Payoff. The wizard Saruman orders the destruction of Fangorn Forest. Setup.
Burn it. Yes!
Merry and Pippin rally the Ents, who destroy Isengard in retaliation. Payoff.
Yes!
Frodo wishes that Bilbo had killed Gollum, but Gandalf advocates mercy. Setup. Frodo meets Gollum and takes pity on him. This is a reminder. And finally, when all hope is lost, Gollum appears, takes the ring from the corrupted Frodo, and accidentally plummets to his doom, and to the destruction of the One Ring. Payoff.
The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of men.
It is through these structured instances of setup and payoff that a work of fiction constructs its meaning. Giving gifts is good. Disrespecting nature ends badly. Mercy is a virtue. In fact, those of you with curiosity brains might wonder why my channel inaugurationally first video on the Lord of the Rings film trilogy focused nigh exclusively on the events of Amon Hen, something which happened off-screen in the books. The answer to this is that this section is my favorite section of the entire series for the reasons I implicitly explained in that video. To explain explicitly, Amon Hen is a payoff bonanza of the various setups that the film The Fellowship of the Ring, which is the best one, has spent 3 to 4 hours-ish of time meticulously crafting. Films, such as the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, have a relatively easier time pulling this off as they functionally complete their own payoffs. The audience does not participate directly in any way. They observe and construct meaning from images. Narratively focused video games like Final Fantasy VII, however, are in an interestingly sticky situation, as they have to design both a narrative that is a work of fiction in which they must give up at least some control to a prospective player, and a game that is a series of mechanics and obstacles. The best games merge these two categories as much as possible. As intrinsic to the video game medium, narrative is told emergently rather than linearly. Even in a mostly linear story with very little room for variation like Final Fantasy VII, the player is still in control of how long the different sequences play out, which characters are present in the party, how over or under-leveled the party is when they encounter challenges, so on and so forth. So, while there is so much to praise about Final Fantasy VII, and we'll be doing a lot of that, trust me, special attention must be given to its design, both its narrative design and its game design. Final Fantasy is titularly a fantasy series, and therefore its stories have fantastic elements, such as magic, people with superhuman abilities, mythic monsters and creatures, in-depth secondary worlds to explore, people dressed in strange and elaborate outfits. In fact, the closer a fantasy world is to being solely authored by Tetsuya Nomura, the stranger and more elaborate its outfits become. As such, Final Fantasy VII's narrative team had a lot they had to teach the player, namely how to play Final Fantasy VII and how to read Final Fantasy VII. And for a series and series contributor who would go on to become famous for their convoluted, esoteric, difficult-to-comprehend works of fantasy fiction, Final Fantasy VII's fantastical elements are surprisingly clean and simple to comprehend. This is for two main reasons: interconnectedness and personability. What do I mean by this? Well, all of Final Fantasy VII's fantasy elements are conceptually interwoven, meaning to explain one is to offer at least a partial explanation of all of the others. In other words, to learn about one element of Final Fantasy VII's fiction is to learn at least a little bit about all of the others. Let me demonstrate what I mean. In a series, perhaps infamous for its convolution, Final Fantasy VII burdens its audience with merely two fantasy elements: the life stream, a subterranean, preternatural substance containing the life essence, consciousness, and collective memory of all living things, and Genova, an extraterrestrial, shape-shifting, hostile organism of unknown origin or motivation. That's unknown origin or motivation, Tetsuya. I see you wanted to over-explain Genova in the remake trilogy. Don't. Sometimes less is more. Please, don't tell us anything. Don't tell us where she's from. Don't tell us what she wants. Let it be mysterious and creepy and weird, okay? We don't I know that you bodily want Genesis to show up and deliver a hamstring poetry-laden monologue about the motivations of Genova, but please, Please, Tetsuya, don't do it. Don't. Just leave it unknown. And that's it. It's from this simple list of 2 fantasy elements that Final Fantasy VII crafts its plot. Connected to the life stream is Mako, the life stream forcefully extracted from the earth, condensed and used as a power source. Materia, a crystallization of the life stream, specifically from the memory of a former living thing, which, when equipped, allows the user to cast magic. And finally, the Ancients, or the Cetra, humans with the ability to make contact with the consciousness of the life stream, usually explained with the metaphorical phrase, speaking to the planet. And from Jenova, we have members of Soldier, people who are showered in Mako and then infused with Jenova cells, which grant them superhuman abilities. And the Reunion, which is a process in which, if dismembered, Jenova cells will eventually animate and endeavor to gather themselves together to reform Jenova herself. And from this interconnected web of branching fantasy elements, we can parcel interesting things from the way the story divvies out its information. For example, we learn about Mako energy and Eris' status as a Cetra before we are fully taught what the lifestream is or how it functions. Thereby, our initial understanding of both Mako and the Cetra are at first incomplete, and then contextualized with additional substance later. It is through this non-linear dissemination of information about its fantastic elements that Final Fantasy VII is able to craft much of the substance of its big moments. By the time we're in a temple and Eris is talking to the planet with her mind, we have spent enough time in the world of the fiction to cultivate an understanding of what the lifestream is and the existential threat posed to it, to appreciate what Eris is doing. 20-ish hours of game have spent significant resources making this moment as meaningful and easy to understand as possible. If, say, Final Fantasy VII came out swinging with this sort of thing, it would be too confusing to really get into. With another example, we learn about Soldier before we fully understand what Jenova is, or what Jenova's reunion is. By the time we find out all of the relative information, some 25 to 30-ish hours into the game, the narrative is ready to make us scream with what it's about to do to Cloud. These fantastical elements also provide intrinsic explanations for why Shinra and Sephiroth are such existential threats to the planet, and therefore all life in general, and the life of the main cast specifically. Shinra's extraction and exploitation of the life stream in the form of Mako energy is, in essence, eating up life's capacity to exist. Jenova's motivations, or even if she has the ability to have motivations, are unclear, and should remain unclear, Tetsuya. And her avatar Sephiroth boldly announces his desire to murder every living thing on the planet, meld with all of the spiritual energy that is produced from such mass murder, and then use that collective knowledge for the purpose of apotheosis. Sephiroth, one imagines, would not be a very nice god. And so, from the interconnectedness of its fantastical elements, Final Fantasy VII designs itself with the capability of crafting interesting, shocking, and tear-inducing plot developments with the way it decides to parcel information. Its elements are holistic. You cannot learn about one aspect of Final Fantasy VII's world and story without learning a little bit of something about the other aspects. Thereby, in its best moments, Final Fantasy VII's story's twists are not merely shocking, but are the provision of additional information which deepens or recontextualizes our understanding of its secondary world. Its shocks are the shocks of discovery. So the next ingredient in Final Fantasy VII's brilliance is the fact that it uses this web of interconnected fantastical elements to contextualize its 3 main opposing factions: Avalanche, the Shinra Corporation, and the Duumvirate of Jenova and Sephiroth. Our heroes in Avalanche want to protect the lifestream, and our villains want to exploit it for their own dubious purposes. However, it is important to point out that our villainous factions are not in league. In fact, Sephiroth is just as likely to murder any members of Shinra, unfortunate enough to witness his powerful early polygonal stride and haircut, as he is any of the members of Avalanche. Shinra wants him dead just as badly as our heroes do, and just as badly as Shinra wants our heroes dead. This multi-layered conflict provides the story with all kinds of interesting segments. However, more important than that, for the purposes of this discussion, is to talk about personability. While this is not strictly speaking the Webster Dictionary definition, I'm using personability to mean the act of making fantastical elements, as well as fantastic setups and payoffs, deeply personal to the main characters, and thereby the audience. All 9 playable characters have a personal connection to Shinra, usually in the form of them having previously worked for Shinra or having their lives be rendered materially worse by Shinra's actions. And 3 playable characters, with 1 character in particular, have personal connections to Sephiroth, and by extension, Jenova. Sephiroth and Jenova have connections to Shinra as well, with the former being a member of Soldier and the latter being the means with which the Soldier program was facilitated. Therefore, Shinra's hubris and misunderstanding of exactly what Jenova was led to Sephiroth. The creation of Sephiroth leads to Cloud, Tifa, and Vincent's current circumstances. Shinra's violent and careless expansion as an imperial global corporate conglomerate leads directly to the destruction of Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, Aerith, Yuffie, and Vincent's lives. Shinra's irresponsible and unethical scientific experiments lead to profound trouble for Cloud, Red 13, and Vincent. And finally, Shinra's recklessness in its handling of business and its disregard for the lives of ordinary people lead to Kate Sith, Vincent, and Sid forsaking their former employment with the company. In other words, Final Fantasy VII's intricately and meticulously crafted narrative design allows for nearly all of its various plot developments to both A, reveal and contextualize an aspect of its fictional world, and B, illuminate previous or provide wholly new impact upon characters which we have been invited to care about. So, for example, at the climax of Act 3, when reaching the end of the Whirlwind Maze, learning about Jenova's reunion not only provides additional information on just what Jenova is, but it also provides heart-wrenching implications for Cloud's past, and immediate misfortune on his and everybody else's immediate present. Every single one of Final Fantasy VII's large story payoffs deliver this particular brand of 1-2 punch so masterfully that it's both a shock and a tragedy that its makers have been unable to ever pull this off in any other game in their works of fiction, or even their works which expand upon or retell this very game. This terrible fact, this horrid instance of reality, that Final Fantasy VII's makers do not understand what made Final Fantasy VII great with enough clarity to reproduce any of its crowning achievements in its subsequent games, let alone all of them, constitutes the greatest human tragedy in all of fiction. And listen, I know how hysterical that sentence sounds, okay? But it's a sentence born from the wailing moans of my soul. And stop. Don't you dare comment below that you liked something about Advent Children. No one who likes Advent Children is allowed to come to any of my birthday parties. And I know you're watching this video, Tetsuya. I know you learned English enough to watch this video. Please, don't have Genesis show up and explain what Jenova is. Please, please. I'll accept the plot ghosts, okay? I'll put up with the plot ghosts if you just don't have Genesis show up and explain what Jenova is. Please. Please don't do it, Tetsuya. It is at this point in the video that we come to a discussion of intricate and profound philosophical implication. Aside from a minor array of binary choices which determine which one of 4 potential date sequences they will experience upon their second mandatory visit to the Gold Saucer, players of Final Fantasy VII have no impact or control over what happens in the plot. Interactions with that very plot exclusively manifest in the form of dialogue boxes, scripted field scenes, scripted instances of battle, and cutscenes. Herein lies our philosophical quandary. If Final Fantasy VII doesn't let you pick dialogue options, awkwardly and robotically flirt with your party members, or choose which 2 of your least interesting crewmates die in a completely preventable manner, is it even a video game at all? Well, I would argue that Final Fantasy VII is not so much a game you author, but rather a game you enact. Unlike Fallout New Vegas, which casts the player as co-author, Final Fantasy VII casts its players as director. While the player's input has no power over Cloud's fate, they do get to pilot his meat body sack around the world. They may chat or not chat with as few or as many NPCs as they wish. They manage his equipment and the equipment of his allies. They decide which companions accompany him throughout much of his journey. And I'm not being churlish or grasping at straws here either. I think that these are fundamentally interesting things to be given control of. Perhaps the most interesting and most in-depth of Final Fantasy VII's means to allow you to enact a story come through in its magic system, or rather its hybrid class/magic system. It is common RPG fare to include a cast of characters with distinct classes, each possessing distinct abilities. Gameplay challenge and thereby gameplay interest are fed by crafting class combinations to learn synergies and take on certain challenges. Final Fantasy VII itemizes this class system. Rather than having your characters learn skills directly, the individual pieces of materia learn the skills, and loan the skills out to you interest-free in exchange for a place on the limited real estate of your weapons and armor. This is fitting, as materia are the literal crystallization of human memory. To equip a piece of materia is to incorporate someone else's personality and experience into your own. This customizability is so vast that you can twist each character's role suggestion basic stats into any making of your choosing. For example, Barrett's high HP, vitality, and general bulkiness suggest that you make him your tank. They even give you a materia earlier in the game that might as well be called "Give This to Barrett." However, through trinket, materia, and magic source manipulation, you can turn him into your strongest mage. Another example, Eris's restorative limit breaks, thematic association with flowers, general supportiveness, and propensity to dress in fluorescent pink might make the player think,
okay, I guess she's the white mage.
However, with a little legwork, you can make enemies quiver beneath the mighty weight of her whapping sticks. However, this radical versatility must cause some astute viewers to wonder to themselves, if materia learns all the skills, then isn't every character basically the same class? And if stats can become whatever you want them to be with just a little bit of grinding, then isn't every character basically just the same character? Why then would you choose one character over the other? This is an interesting hiccup. While the problem pointed out here is not exactly untrue, it isn't quite true either. In fact, in case within this laissez-faire approach to character class creation that an inferior game might totally mess up, Final Fantasy VII manages a perhaps unintentional brilliance. I find this system utterly captivating in a way that no other Magic system has come close to, because of the endless ways that the player can customize and express characterization for this ragtag crew of globe-trotting freedom fighters. You see, the individual members of Final Fantasy VII's Buddy Brigade have three distinct uniquities that differentiate them. One is their meticulously choreographed, animated, and theatrically presented limit breaks. Two is their unmodified stats and stat progression. And three is their story-revealed personalities. Achieving a working understanding of these characters presents the player with meaningful opportunities to express their characterization with the material loadout the player gives them. Limit breaks become character expressions, and unmodified stats become gentle suggestions from the game designers about what kind of material loadouts you should craft for each player. As mentioned before, you are free to ignore them, but from this freedom can be crafted profound meaning. Let me explain what I mean. For example, the aforementioned Barrett's limit breaks associate his character with machines and explosives. I choose to express this aspect of Barrett's personality in his use of grenades, Molotovs, S-mines, and right arms. Barrett's stats suggest that you spec him as a tank, and I heed this direction, giving Barrett a generous amount of HP pluses and boosts to his already naturally endowed vitality stat. However, Barrett's character is that of a kind-hearted, protective man who struggles and eventually succeeds in channeling his rage into a desire to protect others. I choose to express this aspect of Barrett's character by making him my white mage instead of Eris. My Barrett, therefore, spends just as much time healing and buffing his buds as he spends shooting punks and throwing grenades at boogans. By contrast, Cloud's limit breaks are flashy and emphasize spectacle. One could call them show-offish. Cloud's stats are very well balanced, revealing him to be a character who could succeed in any role provided he put his mind into it. And so I choose to express Cloud's initial standoffishness, too cool for school attitude by imagining that he refuses to equip a single piece of materia that does not grant him immediate offensive capabilities. As the game progresses and Cloud matures, supportive skills slowly sneak their way into his loadout. The game is full of little brilliances like this. Tifa's daisy chain approach to limit breaks, as well as her decision to make her punching gloves literally 50% of the fabric that she wears on her person, give me the impression that she didn't spend all those years learning martial arts just to cast regen and fire 2 every turn. So, my Tifa always eschews magic spells of any sort, even in the remake, and is instead spec'd to punch as hard as she can and as often as she can. Vincent's limit breaks allow the player to transform him into one of 4 kinds of monster. Using Vincent's limit break gifts the player with impressive abilities, but also takes away control of one of their 3 active party members. Therefore, the player is disincentivized to make Vincent their healer, while his impressive magic stat makes him a prime candidate for late-game super spells like Flare and Ultima. Also, he is such the kind of person who would equip both the Odin materia and the Hades materia. But of course, none of this stuff would matter at all if the game didn't have masterfully crafted structure and characters with which to contextualize it. The plot for Final Fantasy VII can be roughly divided into 4 acts. Act 1 is a linear Hollywood movie-esque action sequence concerning Midgar. Act 2 is an old-school video gamey world traversal fun time under the plot umbrella of searching for Sephiroth. Act 3 is an anxiety trepidation build-up concerning Genova's reunion, and finally Act 4 is a sprint to the finish action piece sequence which neatly ties up all of the game's dangling plot threads. Each section provides a distinct narrative function, a distinct manner of pacing, and a different contextualizing framing device. Act 1 in Midgar is all about introductions. It introduces 5 of the 9 principal characters, both of the principal villains, and both of the fantastical elements which will be used for the construction of the fiction. Its pacing is most like that of a film. It contains the majority of the game's cutscenes, set pieces, and high-octane moments. Much like its locomotively inclined in medias res introduction, it thrusts the player into the world through exciting spectacle and a narrative sense of urgency.
Blow up the reactor. Escape the train. Defeat the boss. Get back to Sector 7. Find Tifa in Wall Market. Get back to Sector 7. Get to the top of Sector 7's pillar. Get out of Sector 7. Traverse the dangers of the Shinra building to rescue Eris. Get out of the Shinra building before the cops turn you into corpses.
This is the story's hook, its prologue, if you will. The plot has masterfully introduced nearly every single one of its elements and themes, established effective characters and their preliminary relationships, and even touched on the game's 3 principal themes. Act 1 in Midgar is a dense, action-packed linear roller coaster, and its climax invites the players to be thrilled. It also perfectly understands that the player will be a little bit exhausted by the end of it, and will be in the possession of several questions. A poorly crafted story, undisciplined in its application of structure, will try to distract the player from their questions with additional spectacle, assuming the story would recognize the player's mood at all. Final Fantasy VII avoids this amateurish pitfall. Like any master story craftsman, it takes the anticipated player's feelings and questions and incorporates them into the story's perfect structure. The following section, Act 2, where we search for the man in the black cape, soothes the player's overstimulation from Act 1 with what I will call ease, and Carrot on a Stickly tantalizes the player and their questions with mystery, and the promise of payoff. Once we leave Midgar, Final Fantasy VII slows down and opens up. It becomes a bit more like its 2D predecessors. Rather than just throwing away everything that made the series great like a bad game would do, it recontextualizes the old, proven ideas into ways that support and enhance its current story and story aims. So it gives the player a large world map to explore with various towns to visit. It gives one complete control over which party members accompany Cloud through the world, gifting the player with a which side character will get the spotlight this episode-ish style of narrative control. These are things which the previous section in Midgar mostly denied you. Thus, in Act 2, you have graduated from actor to director. You get to decide how long the characters linger in each section of the map before the next episode of Final Fantasy VII begins. You get to decide which characters get the focus in each episode within reasonable constraints. You can even make cuts. You can cut Fort Condor out of this section of Final Fantasy VII's plot by simply running past it, though the game strongly invites you to visit its location and sympathize with its inhabitants. You can cut Yuffie out of the story entirely by never recruiting her, or you can decide that Yuffie will not come into the party until later by encountering her elsewhere. You can just not go to Gongaga and bypass all of its plot developments in the simple choice of driving right past it. You don't have to go to Wutai at all. The game becomes that chill. Narratively speaking, in Act 2, there's no upstanding sense of immediate urgency. The game relaxes and lets the player loose for a while, all within the framework of tracing the steps of the game's major antagonist, Sephiroth. This ease of pace is accompanied with the first instances of character and plot development. The player meets the remainder of the game's characters, both party members and supporting cast. Several characters complete their character arcs, and nested subjects like Mako, the livestream, and the nature and motives of Sephiroth are explored and explained in further detail. While introduction was the primary function of Act 1, Development is the primary function of Act 2. It is in the nature of video games to allow the audience to, in essence, hang out with development. Hangout ability is a powerful narrative tool unique to video games. For example, Mass Effect 2, the only Mass Effect game to achieve greatness, literally builds itself around hanging out with its principal characters. In Final Fantasy VII's Act 2, the main event is visiting towns. Each town contains something of a self-contained story, with most of them being about one or more of Final Fantasy VII's main cast members. Each town also presents opportunities to chat with veteran and rookie party members alike, as well as deep dives into various backstories. These backstories and character development segments work because they are providing additional information about topics and characters we already possess some knowledge about and interest in. It deepens our understanding and appreciation of Final Fantasy VII's cast, themes, and fantastic concepts. It's in Act 2 where Final Fantasy VII crafts its depth. Depth is a discursive term one often hears in discussions of fiction. It is always presented as a positive quality. To claim a story has depth is to praise it. To claim a story lacks depth is to criticize it. But what do we mean when we say depth? Well, most of the time when people invoke the word depth, what they're really saying is,
I like it.
If I might cite personal experience, studying words in a scholastic setting has taught me that most people don't really think about their word choice. And when they say that something is good and something is bad, what they're really saying is,
I like it.
Or,
I don't like it.
But I know someone who sure does think about his word choice, and that guy has a vested interest in making sure that you, and by you I do mean exactly you, understands what he's talking about. So, when I say that Final Fantasy VII develops, that it crafts depth, what am I talking about? Well, let's begin with pointing out that the depth discussion is taking place within the structure section. And let's draw special attention to my use of the verb craft. Depth is not something a story has, it is something the story crafts, something the story makes. And a story crafts its depth through its structure. I have said before that the Midgar section functionally introduces every single one of Final Fantasy VII's fantastic elements, and most of Final Fantasy VII's major characters. This Midgar section allows us to know. We know what the characters are talking about when they discuss the fiction's fantastic elements like Mako energy, or the fiction's momentous forces like the Shinra Corporation, or Sephiroth. When Sephiroth announces in Cloud's retelling of his past in Calm that he is trying to find the Promised Land, we know what he's talking about thanks to things which have happened in the Shinra building. When the people of Fort Condor discuss their militant opposition to Shinra, we know exactly what they're talking about because that's exactly what we've been doing, and we've seen the lengths that Shinra will go to defend their exploitative interests. When the villagers of Junon talk about how much it sucks to literally live beneath a Shinra city, we know what they're talking about because we just spent 8 hours running around the Midgar slums. So it is in the Midgar section that the story is crafting its setup. It provides us with knowledge. When Bugenhagen discusses the lifestream, or when Eris interacts with the planet in the Temple of the Ancients, the story is developing its setups by making us understand them on a deeper, more emotional level. And when the story makes things personal, when it makes its sections and towns about its characters, it's inviting us to care. So, when we listen to Barrett exposit his mission statement in Mako Reactor 1, we know that Mako energy is harmful to the planet. When we listen to Bugenhagen discuss the intricacies of the lifestream and the study of planet life, we come to understand why Mako energy is harmful. And when we complete the Corel/Gold Saucer section of the game, the section which is primarily about Barrett, we get to see the costs that Mako energy has incurred upon a character that we've spent time with and care about. It's through the invocation of the abstract upon a human person that we come to care. We want to stop the Shinra Corporation not just because we know of and understand logically the detrimental effects their antics are having on the world and the people in it, but also because of what they have done to our buddy Barrett. It becomes personal. The player has been given the richest invitation to care as possible. And so, in the events of the penultimate dungeon spell Shinra's Doom, it feels like a victory. To say that a story has depth is to say that a story has carefully organized itself in such a manner as to gift its audience with both logical understanding and emotional meaning. A good storyteller knows that their audience is a solid wall of logical shielding surrounding a mushy emotional core. The logic brain must be satisfied before a person will give themselves permission to be emotionally invested. If for example, one spends their 20s indulging in enough YouTube video critique essayists, one might notice a particular pattern to their criticism. A bad media product is one in which the flaws in the story's logic prevent one from allowing themselves to feel an emotion. A guilty pleasure is a situation in which one allows themselves to feel an emotion despite the flaws evident in that story's logic. And beloved works are ones in which the story logic and the invitations to emotionality synergize enough that the subject allows themselves to love it. And so it is with the first half of Final Fantasy VII. Act 1 in Midgar, through the time-tested methods of spectacle, stellar pacing, and interwoven exposition, provides an indelible foundation of logic to its world and fantasy elements that, by the time that Act 2 comes around and begins to send out its myriad of invites to emotionality, the player is well primed to allow themselves such emotion. This is why the game's ironclad, interlaced, and deeply nested fantasy elements are so important, and so impressive. So tight and seamless are Final Fantasy VII's fantastic foundations, that the concepts built upon them are easily digestible to one's logic brain. In fact, they are so tight and seamless that if one tried to shove another fantastical element amid them, say a platoon of dimension-hopping plot ghosts who just they're getting in the way of what's happening, it just might set a bit of a rot about the load-bearing structures, causing the logic brain to rush back in and prevent one from allowing themselves that precious dose of emotionality. But enough about that. Let's get back to talking about a game which definitely has not ruined its own story via the unnecessary addition of needless fantastic elements.
Final Fantasy VII.
And how its own tightly woven and meticulously crafted fantastic elements set the stage for wonderful characters and heartfelt themes. A wise man would deduce that nobody would like Final Fantasy VII at all if it wasn't for its cast of incredibly depthful, multifaceted characters. Characters are the aspect of a work of fiction from which we come to care. And while a foolish man would opine that themes are for 8th grade book reports, themes are the aspects of a work of fiction through which we come to feel. From these concepts, an observant man would gift to himself the lenses with which to notice a profound truth. The soul, for lack of a better word, of a work of fiction is the greater sum of its characters and theme, with design and structure being the context which justifies the characters and their predicaments logically. Perhaps the greatest triumph of Final Fantasy VII, greater than its masterful design and its perfect structure, is its displayed understanding that characters are the story's greatest tool with which it can guide its observers to embrace its deep, inscrutable, thematically textured emotional truth. Its soul. Themes teach us how to perceive and eventually love a story's soul. And any author who does not fully understand the themes of their own story can only ever make a bad story. Luckily for us, Final Fantasy VII is not a bad story. Its makers understand that all the hard work they've invested into its design, pacing, and story structure would amount to a large pile of nothing if it did not include a cast of colorful, relatable, well-developed characters. As somewhat discussed in previous sections, Final Fantasy VII goes to great lengths to tie its characters into its enemy factions, its plot details, and its fantastic elements. We come to care about these concepts and opposing actors because of the personal impact they have upon these characters. However, what truly elevates the characters beyond the realm of Apollonian structure appreciation into the Dionysian realm of profound emotionality is the themes its makers weave into every aspect of their characterization. Good characters are characters which we come to care for as if they were real people. When people say, for example, that J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth feels like a character, what they're really saying is they have come to care for the world as if it were a person. And themes are that for which we come to feel. When you jump out of your seat in triumph whenever King Theoden says, "And Rohan will answer," it is because the Lord of the Rings film trilogy has just spent about 8 hours meticulously teaching you that friendship and cooperation is good. When Theoden decides to be cooperative, we feel good. When Denethor decides to be uncooperative, we feel bad. This is why you weep like an idiot whenever the Riders of Rohan show up for the Battle of Pelennor Fields. It's like, dude, the whole nation, they would literally just rather die than be bad friends. Thus, the theme of fellowship in The Lord of the Rings makes its presence known. Getting back to the topic at hand, Final Fantasy VII displays 3 prominent themes within its literature: that of nature versus technology, loss, and the battle each character faces with their Jungian shadow. Nature versus technology is perhaps the most obvious and superficial theme, being presently observable in the industrial pipes crudely nailed to quaint cottages, in civic megastructures being placed literally above and to the detriment of pastoral villages, or in the details like a large bird nesting atop a Mako reactor. This makes the world feel lived in. It makes the struggle between Avalanche and Shinra feel important. However, while The Lord of the Rings unabashedly associates its nature themes with good and its industrial themes with evil, Final Fantasy VII affords itself the opportunity to be more nuanced and ambivalent. While it never shies away from the clear detriments of Mako energy, the town, which is presented as the most harmonious with nature, Cosmo Canyon, still uses wind turbines and machines. The aforementioned Fort Condor sees a group of concerned dissenters defending rare wildlife from the cold clutches of the man with swords, bombs, catapults, and barricades. And, most pertinently, the eventual saviors of the planet would not have achieved their mission if not for the use of several complex machines. While The Lord of the Rings uses images of industry to codify the corrupting evil infecting its world, Final Fantasy VII's use of industrialization coding suggests instead that the world is struggling to find a balance with competing paradigms. The oil-punk city of Midgar is clearly too much industrialization, being a rotting metropolis that is literally 50% slums, and is demonstrably reducing the land around it into a barren, lifeless wasteland. However, the frigid wasteland of the Great Glacier and Gaia's Cliff are their own kind of hostile to life. The only human you meet here literally tells you a story about how this place made his best friend kill himself. Thus is Final Fantasy VII's world's struggle to balance nature and industry reflected in the characters' struggles to bring balance to themselves. Cloud and Vincent are metahumans whose current biology is influenced by greed-driven scientific meddling. Barrett has turned 25% of his limbs into a death machine. Kate Sith is probably a robot? From these observations, we can trace a path from the unifying thematic features of these various characters. Each of the 9 playable characters in our Buddy Brigade has lost something dear. Each of the 9 playable characters in our Buddy Brigade is putting on some kind of front. The game takes considerable care towards guiding each of its characters into a confrontation with their own loss and their own affectations. The characters follow a general pattern of facing, understanding, and overcoming these obstacles and becoming truer, nobler, more powerful versions of themselves. At each instance, the audience is invited to see this overcoming as heroic, even aspirational. Thus, from these interwoven, masterfully crafted, and yet deceptively simple tricks, Final Fantasy VII crafts its moral argument. It crafts its deeply woven, masterfully designed, perfectly structured emotional truths. All of us suffer from loss. All of us have built detrimental structures atop ourselves. However, finding the courage to face, understand, and overcome these occurrences is a great virtue. It makes one heroic. One is not born a hero. One crafts themselves to become a hero by confronting both their inner darkness and the world at large. Now, I won't speak for you, but I will speak for myself. I've suffered loss. I spent nearly all of junior high and high school putting on a front. I affectatiously performed an idea that I thought would get people to like me. Nobody bought it. I played Final Fantasy VII young. I was so young when I first played Final Fantasy VII that I do not recall the first time I played it. I do not remember a version of myself who has not played Final Fantasy VII. Returning to the game always feels like returning to a piece of myself. It is a part of me. I internalized its themes and its moral arguments long before I consciously or logically understood them. Around the time I was 17, I embarked on a little journey of my own. I confronted myself and endeavored to untangle my front, to bring balance between the nature of myself and the industry that I had built on top of it. An industry which was literally sucking the soul right out of me. It's now been close to 12 years since I embarked upon this journey, and there have been some spectacular results. I'm a much happier, much kinder, much more likable person now, thanks to the effort that Final Fantasy VII inspired me into putting into myself. Much like the Buddy Brigade decides that the world is worth saving, so too did I decide that I was worth saving. The soul of a work of fiction is that which we come to love. Soul is that inscrutable bit of human idiosyncrasy which anyone except for born haters intuitively notice and struggle to fit into human words. Great works of literature are great because they provide a discursive, experiential lexicon with which we can talk about our souls. Great works of literature feel like people. For me, Final Fantasy VII feels like my oldest and dearest friend. A friend I can turn to whenever I'm lost or I'm in need of some kind of emotional catharsis. If one can come to love a work of literature, then one can certainly come to love themselves. And if one can come to love themselves, then one can certainly come to love another person. I genuinely believe that this wacky, silly, multi-textual video game made me a better person. And as always, I have been and continue to be Zachary Kush. And you just learned why I love Final Fantasy VII in as short a time as I could manage, and how it doomed me to become an author. Thank you very much for watching. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to my patrons. VladIV, or is that Vlad4? You'll have to tell me. Katelyn Kuehnhold, and my dearest friend in the whole world, Brandon Kuehnhold. Thank you all so much for your support, I really appreciate it. And thank you, and I do mean exactly you, for watching this video to the end. There's gonna be another big video on Final Fantasy VII where I go through the whole story, and that video is gonna be much longer than this one. So you have to look forward to that. And I will talk about the remake at some point, especially with Remake Part 2 coming out soon, relatively soon. And then there's also that Fallout New Vegas Part 2 that I have to make, so I'll be working on that. Thank you for watching, and I hope you stick around to whatever nonsense falls out of my brain in the future. Goodbye!